of housekeeping, including some substantive housekeeping. In going over your assignment one, I discovered several of you made some similar mistakes, or at least just were confused about the same things. And first had to do with Westlaw, because Westlaw categorizes secondary sources as text and treatises, which I grant you is confusing, but that's part of bibliographic awareness, is being aware of when your resource is confusing. So within secondary sources, we see texts and treatises, but not all entries in here are treatises. So some of you referred to, I think, Amdur Trials, or just regular old Amdur the Encyclopedia. These are very different. Well, okay, Amdur the Encyclopedia is very different than a treatise. It covers all the topics, legal topics you could think of, A to Z, and not very much depth. Amdur Trials is kind of like ALR and kind of like Amdur Proof of Facts, which we looked at a little bit and we'll be looking at again. Again, does not cover any single topic, covers a wide range of topics. Amdur Trials, Amdur Proof of Facts goes into more depth. The importance is just that you understand what you're looking at. If you find an Amdur Trials that's great for your topic, great if it helps you. Less important that you know, oh my goodness, is this a treatise or is this not a treatise? But again, when you're looking at, just think about, again, be aware. So a treatise, again, the best way to tell it's a treatise is it's on a particular subject. So those of you who found treatises on drugs, found treatises on antitrust, on single topics, even if those topics were pretty broad. I mean, you can find a treatise on constitutional law, that's pretty broad, but that will still be a treatise as opposed to Amdur jurisprudence, or American jurisprudence, or Amdur Trials, or Proof of Facts. That's just a particular resource that covers a bunch of different topics. Questions? Again, some questions came up regarding issue spotting. And I'll be honest with you, I find issue spotting one of the most difficult aspects to teach, in part because I'm hoping that you're learning that throughout your other classes in those particular areas of law, how to spot those issues. But I tried to come up with some tips. So one thing to ask yourself is, think about what your client wants. In the case of your assignment, your client wants to start a business. Your client wants to advertise. Your client isn't being sued, so she doesn't want to defend herself. She doesn't want to sue anybody like our client does in our class hypothetical with the HMO. So think about that as you think about the terms you search. So for instance, in our assignment hypothetical, your client wants to produce a tea product. So in your hypothetical, I mentioned that she wants to advertise that it has polyphenols. And yes, that actually is a real thing, polyphenols. Think about the words you're going to search in the index. If you're still using print, you're going to type a line in Google, in Westlaw, in Lexis, whatever you're using. Is this word central to what my client wants? Is polyphenol central? Yeah, she wants to advertise it, but what if she wanted to advertise, you've all heard of antioxidants, right? Does it matter that it's polyphenols or antioxidants or vitamin C or low fat or whatever it is she wants to claim? You're not sure yet, you're just new to the issue, but ask yourself those questions. Do the terms make a difference? Does polyphenol make a difference? Sort of saying the same thing in different ways. Some terms you need to be careful about, the sort of what I call generic legal terms, like liability. Is liability central to the client or tea client, her issue? Maybe, maybe not. She's not suing anybody. She's not being sued. Is liability central to our HMO client? More likely because our HMO client wants to hold somebody liable, right? The HMO. No guarantee any of these questions are always going to give you the greatest terms, but just some ways to maybe think about the issue spotting. The other thing I will plead with you again, a few of you didn't listen, and I'm hoping maybe you did on assignment 2 and certainly in the assignments going forward. If I suggest you do one service first and answer all the questions, then do the other service, give it a try. A couple of people broke my heart and missed questions because they tried to do it all at once. And I understand it seems easier to do it that way, but especially if you missed a couple on the first assignment, give it a try and see if it makes sense for you as an organizational tool. Any questions? Okay. So that's housekeeping number 1. Housekeeping number 2, thank you to all of you who have submitted assignment 2. If I did not reply to you, it's either because A, you sent it to me after 3:30 and I'm no longer on email, so I will reply to you later on, or B, if you sent it and you don't get an email from me later on or first thing tomorrow morning, check back with me. The reason I do that is because once in a while things get caught in spam, especially if you're sending from Gmail or Yahoo or wherever you're sending from these days. So just make sure you get that reply from me. Okay, and housekeeping number 3, which isn't really housekeeping because it's substantive. Between our last class 2 weeks ago and today, I ran across a section in the U.S. Code that just gave a nice example of what you will see if there is a section on Lexis, Westlaw, or Bloomberg that needs to be updated, and updated. So we see an example here on what it looks like on Westlaw, and you see a red flag. And a red flag enacted legislation. Notice it's not what we've seen before, the yellow flag. I'm in the way, huh? Proposed legislation. How's that? Shift myself over here. And notice it says enacted legislation. It was amended by PL 114-94. And sure enough, if we click on our currentness link and go down, we see it's current through, our Westlaw is current through PL 114-114, excluding 114-92, 114-94. So you see how it's coming together? You see how the two connect? So most importantly, you see the red flag. Let's get back to the top. The red flag means that you need to update, and update. Secondarily, if you understand how the two connect, that it's telling us we haven't included everything in PL 114-94, and it says that in our currentness link. What that looks like on Lexis. Remember, Shepard's is our updating service on Lexis. Many of you know. And we have a red yield sign. I've never seen a red yield sign before, but we've got one here on Lexis. Legislative Alert Service, acts affecting this document. And you go and click on, so that's what you would see on Lexis if your section required updating, and updating. And last but not least, Bloomberg. Interestingly, we don't see any color, red flags, seals, anything on Bloomberg. But if we are being bibliographically aware and reading, it's actually telling us current through Public Law 114-124. So here's an instance Bloomberg's already incorporated it. So just one example of how they are different, and Bloomberg's actually a little more up to date. Any questions about updating, and updating statutes? So that gives me a kind of funky segue, because now we move, instead of looking forward into updating, and updating, we look backwards into legislative history. And here is where, I like to say, the rubber meets the road, and we are indeed in advanced legal research, because I sort of suspect you haven't run into legislative history much in any other of your classes. And I will say, not in the hopes of not intimidating you, legislative history is one of the more challenging aspects of any kind of legal research. I've known law librarians who find legislative history a little challenging. And I say that again, not to intimidate you, but to encourage you that if you're finding this confusing, you're not alone. I'm going to do my best to make it as clear as I can. One of the reasons you do have this rather tome of a paper handout is I wanted to give you pages to look back at later on as you're doing your assignment, as you're trying to go through and make sense of it all, in the hopes that it might jog your memory. Because hopefully, as I explained it to you today, it makes sense, but it may be in a week, 2 weeks, you're thinking back, like, I thought I understood it, but. So again, that's one of the reasons for a lot of pages in the handout. All right, so if legislative history is so challenging, why are we bothering? It's not just because it's on the syllabus. Why did I put it there? And I don't expect you to have an answer that's rhetorical. And there are two answers to that question. Well, two main answers to that question. First, and I think really foremost, to determine legislative intent. Anybody know what that means? So when we're looking at statutes and we're reading the language of the statutes, the legislature passed that statute, right? They chose those words particularly. And as you've read enough cases by now that revolve around statutes, often the cases will revolve around what did the statute mean. Maybe it was poorly drafted. Some of you may remember the controversy decided by the Supreme Court last term about the Affordable Care Act. And there were a few very select words about what the state had to say, and the Supreme Court basically acknowledged, yes, this statute was poorly drafted, but it means state and federal, even though it just said state. So again, the interpretation of a statute can make it up to the Supreme Court. And speaking of the Supreme Court and statutory interpretation, it turns out it is actually a bit of a controversy that now, I have to say, former Justice Scalia was very much, I do this the hard way, was very much an advocate against using legislative history as a means of interpreting a statute. And what I'm jumping to is the point in the opinion of this one case in which Justice Scalia sets forth his objections to using legislative intent. So he talks about the greatest defect of legislative history is its illegitimacy. He starts out strong. And so basically, Justice Scalia is arguing that you interpret a statute by the words in the statute. You don't look back to its history. And by its history, by legislative history, I mean all of the documents that were prepared in the course of considering legislation. Believe me, we're going to go into a lot more detail on what that all is. But I wanted to present to you the why first. The why are we going to learn this more difficult area of legislative history. So legislative intent. Now, while Justice Scalia suggests that legislative intent is not a persuasive argument as to what a statute means, there are many other judges who do look to legislative intent. I don't have an example, but Justice Breyer, just to stay with the Supreme Court, is a proponent of using legislative intent. And if you were to Google legislative history, Breyer, Scalia, you would find a whole discussion between the two of them back quite a number of years. And another example, but we're not in another example, and to show you we're not just talking about federal statute and legislative interpretation, here's an example of a New York State case, Chase Scientific, where the interpretation, the use of legislative history was critical in determining the outcome of the case. And I have this little story in my head that there was some enterprising associate in a law firm who did the research of the legislative history of the statutes of limitation law in New York and discovered that there was this one particular document that explained what the legislature did with regard to the statute of limitation. And this enterprising associate, perhaps he or she took advanced legal research someday or at some point, discovered this particular document and discovered this discussion within the legislature about statutes of limitation. And here, this discussion wound up in the decision of the court. This is the New York Court of Appeals, so this is a controlling opinion now for all of the courts in New York. And you can see the highlighted discussion of what the legislature intended. The legislature shortened the statute of limitation for medical malpractice, and just talking a lot about what the legislature intended. So while there is some controversy to using a legislative intent sort of argument, it is one that is used in many courts. So that, to me, is reason number one why we're going to see if we can work our way through legislative history. Reason number two, and we'll look a little bit at it, but actually, honestly, these days we don't have to spend a lot of time because what makes it really easy is, I'll show you a little later on, bill tracking. If there is legislation pending that, say, you're tracking for your client's particularly interested in, or it's your area of specialty, and you want to know what's going on in the law, and you want to see what's happening with this bill, whether it's a state bill or a federal bill, another reason to work through legislative materials and legislative history to see what's going on the status of a bill. A third reason that may be more dearer to your hearts at this stage, but I think you'll find you'll use less frequently once you graduate, and that is if you're writing a note or a paper. Depending on what you're writing on, you may be looking at a statute and may be interested in the legislative history of that particular statute. I'm going to talk less about that, but I will highlight tools that may be useful for that. And of course, if you have any questions, feel free to ask now, come ask me later, whatever works best for you. Okay, so that's the why. Let's now dive into how we're going to work through this and hopefully best understand it. So I tried to do that with the Key to Legislative History Research handout. And by the way, this handout is also available on the course website. I've got the links up here now, but you'll see handouts, so it'll be in the handout if you happen to misplace the pieces of paper. So I tried to boil down legislative history research into 4 doable steps. So the first and foremost is you need to understand the legislative process in detail. What happens from the beginning all the way to the point at the end when we have a law. And as some of you might remember, in our statutes screencast, I made the analogy to Star Wars. So in the original Star Wars trilogy, back when it started in the 70s, we actually started in the middle of the story with episodes 4, 5, and 6 over the span of, I don't know how many years that was. And then, as you may or may not remember, if you're a Star Wars fan, so I made the analogy to starting in the middle of the story with our law. And of course, our hero was our law. But actually what legislative history is the prequel. So if we started with the law in episode 4, our legislative history is the beginning of the story. If Luke starts out as a young man in episode 4, we are looking at Luke's father as a young man in episode 1. And it takes, remember, if you remember Star Wars episodes 1 through 3, take us to the point actually where Luke and Leia are born. So we are going to look at the prequel to our law being signed by the president and see where that begins. And we will do that in just a moment. I'm going to go through the steps and then we'll dive into depth into the legislative process. So once we've understood the legislative process, as we're going through the legislative process, what you want to focus on are the documents that are produced, because those are the documents you're researching to find legislative history. That's what my enterprising associate in the Chase Scientific case found as he or she was researching. He found this legislative commission that talked about the legislative intent. And there are different types of documents that are produced in state legislation versus federal legislation, but the concepts are the same. So to find those documents, what you need to remember, or you need to not remember, to find those documents, what you need to know at the outset is, for federal laws, that all-important public law number. We did a lot of work on what a public law was, and I made you a lot of times read through the little parenthetical, and remember we went through our whole semicolon, take a breath, and it was amended by, there was a reason for that. That was so you understood how to find a public law number. And likewise, same concept, just a different name in the state, in New York State, you understand how to find the chapter law number. Again, all-important public law number, all-important chapter law number are key to finding these legislative history documents. And then our last step in our key to legislative history research is know a few good sources. I'm not going to expect you to know all the details of how to find every single document and how far back it goes and every single source, because honestly, I don't remember that, and it's changing all the time anyway. If you know a few good sources to go to and what those sources are particularly good for and what they may be not particularly good for, then you will have a great start in legislative history research. Okay, so let's get started with understanding the legislative process. And I'm totally serious when I say this in terms of understanding the legislative process. The best way I have found is to get to know our hero here, the law, a little bit better. And the way to get to know him better is, some of you may be familiar, I know Aman has seen this before, you may have seen this before in other classes. Bear with me and watch it again. It's kind of fun. It is a cartoon after all. I mean, how bad can that be? But as you are watching it this go round, focus on when particular documents are mentioned. So if all goes well, the technology will cooperate with me.
City, it's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee, but I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will, but today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, "You're right, there ought to be a law." And he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill. And I'll remain a bill until they decide to make me a law. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And I got as far as Capitol Hill. Well, now I'm stuck in committee, and I'll sit here and wait while a few key congressmen discuss and debate whether they should let me be a law. I hope and pray that they will, but today I'm still just a bill.
Listen to those congressmen arguing. Is all that discussion and debate about you?
Yeah, I'm one of the lucky ones. Most bills never even get this far. I hope they decide to report on me favorably, otherwise I may die.
Die?
Yeah, die in committee. Oh, but it looks like I'm going to live. Now I go to the House of Representatives and they vote on me.
If they vote yes, what happens?
Then I go to the Senate and the whole thing starts all over again.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And if they vote for me on Capitol Hill, well, then I'm off to the White House where I'm waiting online with a lot of other bills for the president to sign. And if he signs me, then I'll be a law. I hope and pray that he will. But today I'm still just a bill.
You mean even if the whole Congress says you should be a law, the president can still say no?
Yes, that's called a veto. If the president vetoes me, I have to go back to Congress and they vote on me again, and by that time you're so
By
old.
that time, it's very unlikely that you become a law. It's not easy to become a law, is it?
No, but how I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill. He signed your bill. Now you're a law. Oh, yeah.
So believe it or not, that gives us a great, more than introduction. Oh, good, we can have lights. And let's cancel that. How many of you had seen it before? Just out of curiosity. Yeah, it's kind of popular these days. Out of the screen here. Okay, now we didn't mention documents directly saying this is a document, but as we will see as we go through, actually, as I said, it's a really good summary and introduction. So let's get started. What I suggest you do, and what I will be working off of as well, is to look at both handouts simultaneously. So we'll start with understand on page 2 of the key handout, understanding the legislative process. And then what I call the walkthrough, the big heavy one, the sample, lots of sample pages as well as some other stuff in there. And that will give us the details that you will need to understand what you're looking at with these legislative documents. And then we will talk about finding them. Okay, so on page 1 of the walkthrough, the thick one, you'll basically see a picture representation of the process. For those of you who are more visually oriented, and maybe not so cartoon oriented, this is another way of representing that process. Honestly, it doesn't make a great deal, doesn't help me any, but if it helps you, that's why I put it in there. So that's page 1. On page 2, you will see a definition of the various different versions of a bill. So, of course, the first document, as we saw, our hero, the bill, is in fact a bill. So there are different versions of the bill. You will most frequently, I believe, encounter 2 versions, engrossed and enrolled. It's not really that critical that you remember the difference. Just understand that if they've reached that stage, they've gone through this entire process and they're well on their way to becoming a law. And honestly, that's all I suggest you worry about. If you're interested, it's there. But let's dive in to the actual documents. So on page 3, you will see the first page of an actual bill. The very first document in our process as we were introduced to our hero. Probably the most important thing to remember about a bill is its abbreviation, because that's what confuses a lot of people. In fact, for legislative history research, and honestly, I kind of think for a lot of different types of research, especially legal research, if you remember the abbreviations, you're halfway there. You might have found that in first year, all those crazy case abbreviations, but once you started learning what AD2D was and NY3D was, it all started to make a little more sense. So, for a bill, you will see 2 different types of abbreviations. As you can see back on the key handout, I listed the abbreviations you'll run across. So, for a bill, you will see HR, how it stands for House of Representatives, and that's going to be a House bill, and you'll see just plain old F for Senate bill. What causes confusion for a lot of people is people think HR stands for House report. Now, we haven't talked about what a report is yet, but we will in a couple of minutes. And so HR kind of makes sense, right? House report, but it isn't. Can't tell you why, but it isn't. If you see HR, you are looking at You're looking at a bill from the House of Representatives. Okay, so the bill is where a measure gets introduced. I think that's pretty straightforward enough. So the next step then, the bill gets referred to committee. Remember, they were standing outside the room and they were talking about how all the congressmen are really arguing about him, and the bill talks about, oh yeah, I'm one of the lucky ones. Most bills die in committee. A bill gets referred to its relevant subject area committee. Committee on Health, Committee on Environment, and it's possible that's as far as the bill gets. And as we heard, that's what happens to most bills. So actually most bills don't even make it beyond getting referred to committee. Some of the bills will actually get considered by the committee, and actually frequently not just the committee but a subcommittee of the committee. If you have a committee of education or a committee on health, you're going to have a lot of subcommittees in various different areas within that larger committee. So within that committee, let's turn to page 5 of the larger handout. Actually, on page 4, you'll see that the bill looks familiar, right? The bill looks like our public law looked, because that's how it started out. And page 5, you'll see the beginning of what a hearing would look like. And here's an example of a hearing on the subcommittee, as I mentioned, on health, which is a subcommittee of the Committee of Ways and Means of the House of Representatives. And again, looking over to our key handout, we see that hearings are going to be abbreviated a whole bunch of different ways, but probably make more sense in terms of just looking at it, not getting confused, as well as figuring out. So if you see S in front of something, it's Senate, H in front of something, it's House, and then hearing, HRG, sometimes they'll spell out hearing. And basically what these hearings are is the committee has people who are either expert in the field or interested, and opinions would be valued for whatever reason, again, probably expertise. They'll have people come in and give their reasons as to why they think the particular bill is a great idea or why they think the particular bill is a terrible idea. Turn to page 6. You'll see the table of contents of the particular hearing we're looking at. And actually, wait, before you turn to back on page 5, notice the number, 107-14. The numbering works similar to a public law numbering, right? You've got the Congress number, and then you have whatever number the hearing is assigned. Don't assume that when you see that number format, it's always a public law. It could be any type of document produced in Congress. We're going to see that style of number quite a lot. But we know it's a hearing by the abbreviation that comes before. That's why understanding the abbreviations are so important. So, okay, let's move ahead to page 6. So you see the table of contents, and you see a couple of different types of contents within this hearing. You see witnesses, people who are actually coming to testify before the subcommittee live. They're going to get on the stand, they're going to raise their right hand, I think, and they're going to say what they think about the particular bill. You also see submissions for the record. There may be groups, as you can see, the American Psychological Association, National Council on Disability. Groups may submit written comments, written ideas, written thoughts on what they think about this particular bill. Turn to page 7. So in the hearing itself, you'll actually see both. And what the oral testimony, people who come to testify in person, look like is on page 7. So you see Chairwoman Johnson refers to Mr. Stark. Mr. Stark starts to speak. Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing on the questions, etc., etc. It looks kind of like a play, right? It's what you're used to reading in a play. So-and-so says this, and then so-and-so says this. So that's essentially what a hearing is, or at least the oral testimony part of a hearing. Okay, so our hero, the bill, has been referred to subcommittee, and he's one of the lucky ones, and he's actually being considered, and they have hearings. Turning the page to page 8, and you'll see this referenced again on page 2 of the key handout. There's something called a committee writ. You won't encounter this very frequently. In fact, most of the time you won't find one. Basically, if the committee is considering a bill that's in a very technical area, maybe science, maybe it's tax, so there's a lot of tax computation and math involved, the committee may say, all right, we need some just basic factual information as background before we can even think about this. So they refer to an expert, and they get a technical explanation on whatever area it is, and that technical explanation appears as a print, as you'll see on page 8. And notice again the abbreviation on top. You can hopefully kind of figure it out. S, first for Senate, PRT, sounds kind of like print. And again, that number, 107-30, and all that's telling me is we're in the 107th Congress, and it's the 30th print, actually, from that committee, or for that committee, I should say. And you can see sort of most of the way down, this is printed for use of the Committee on Finance. And turning to page 9, as I said, prints tend to be very technical areas, so this particular technical area is tax rate reductions. And so it talks a lot about tax rates and all the computations, and you see all those numbers on page 9. And again, it's an example of technical analysis, as I've indicated on the handout. Okay, so again, prints you won't encounter very frequently. In fact, they will be the exception to the rule. You might see them if you're in a technical area, but usually not. That contrasts significantly with our next type of document, and that is a committee report. Whereas prints you're not going to run into very much. Committee report is one of the most important sources for legislative intent. So if you are taking notes, put it in bold, put it in capital letters, highlight it, stars on either side, whatever works for you. Committee report is one of the most important sources if you are looking for legislative intent. I'll explain why in a moment. Let's first just get to know our abbreviations. Again, I don't want you to confuse HR, which remember stands for House Bill, even though HR stands for House of Representatives, but an HR abbreviation is for a bill. Take a look at our key handout, and you will see the abbreviations, HRPT. I didn't put it in the handout. Sometimes, less frequently, you'll see HREP. Kind of makes sense, right? Report, you could sort of guess that. Senate's a little less confusing because you'll see the S. So Senate RPT, Senate REP. Again, HR is not a House report. HR is House of Representatives bill. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the report and see if we can understand why it is one of the best sources for legislative intent. So remember from our video, our hero of the bill gets referred to the committee, really the subcommittee. They hold the hearings. They may be oral testimony, there may be written testimony. Then what happens is the committee votes. The committee, just that committee votes to decide do they think it's a good idea, if it's not a good idea. If they vote and the majority wins that the bill is a good idea, the bill gets reported out. And that's what I said, pay attention to see if you can identify the documents. Remember, they were behind the closed door and they got reported out. When a bill gets reported out of committee, there is a report. Sense, I hope. And that report is by the committee explaining why the committee thinks the bill is a good idea. Basically, the committee, the body of legislators, or really the small subset of legislators who were charged in this particular area, considered this bill, and they voted, and a majority said yes, this is a good idea, and so now they're explaining their rationale as to why they think it's a good idea, and that appears in a committee report. What that looks like in the flesh, or paper as it were, on page 10 of the large handout. So we see, and now I'm going back to our original enactment of ERISA, and here is the report of the Committee on Education and Labor. And basically, it's this committee's rationale is why they think The Employee Benefit Security Act is reported by the committee, and they go on. You see on page 10 is the synopsis, so it's giving a summary of what the bill is. And then on page 11, we've jumped ahead a whole bunch of pages in the report. I wasn't going to make this handout even larger and give you hundreds of pages of report, because some of those reports can be. We jump ahead to an area that most reports have called a section-by-section analysis. So the committee report will do a couple of things. It will give you an overall view of the synopsis of why they think overall this piece of legislation is a good idea, and they will likely give you a section-by-section analysis. Now bear in mind, what we just saw certainly in the cartoon, what I'm describing to you are generalizations. This will not work for every single piece of legislation. It is an incredibly complex process, or can be, depending on what we're considering. I'm giving you the overview, which happens most of the time. Don't get confused if you're looking at a report and it doesn't have a section-by-section analysis. Some reports are 2 paragraphs long because the committee just said, yeah, this is a good idea. And I don't know why they did it. You'd have to go and read all about it, and it wouldn't be worth the time, honestly. But if you are looking for legislative intent, the first place you should go is the committee report. And again, you'd want to look at the overview. There can be a purpose section of the legislation, and then section by section. And the section by section is particularly useful because typically, if you are going to make a legislative intent argument, you are looking at a particular statute section, right? We're looking at section 1144, or maybe 1132, or maybe in New York, we're looking at section 4408. Remember, these are all the sections we were looking at in statutes. And we're looking through, we decide, wait a minute, our client really wants the statute to be interpreted this way. How did the legislature, or really not how, did the legislature say anything about the particular language when they first enacted this particular section? So again, you want the overall purpose because that could be useful. And then you want to look at the section-by-section analysis. And you can see an example of what the section-by-section analysis looks like on page 12, the larger handout. And you see section 101, and then section 102. And then again, I jumped ahead a little bit in the handout. If you go to page 12A, you see what, at least in this report, the committee had to say about section 514, effect on other laws. Remember, that's our section. Any questions about the committee report? So one of the keys I'm hoping you walk away with today is understanding what the committee report is and the fact that it is one of the best sources for legislative intent. Okay, there's another type of document called committee document. And I love when they call name documents because it's just a recipe for confusion. But there's nothing we can do about it. And you won't run into documents, and I don't think you'll have to worry about committee documents too much unless you're doing research on treaties. And then there are particular type. The Senate, of course, considers treaties, and there's a particular type of document called a Senate treaty document because, of course, the Senate is charged by the Constitution to consider treaties. And honestly, there's an explanation in your key handout. If you're really interested, it's there, but I don't think it's necessary to go into too much more detail than that. What you will run into a lot, and it can be a source of legislative intent research, but not nearly as useful as the committee report, and that is the congressional debates. Remember now, our hero got reported out of committee, and then he got dragged. I wonder if I can. Blake, shush,
Well,
sorry.
it's...
Sorry, we're not going to see it again. I just want to show you. Oops. So here he's getting, wait, no, that's a little ahead of our story, just a bit. So after leaving committee, he goes to the entire House of Representatives. So we leave now the committee of the House of Representatives and we go to the entire House of Representatives. Now the committee had their hearings, but now it's the chance for the entire House of Representatives to discuss the measure. And the way they do that is in congressional debates. If any of you watch or ever watch C-SPAN, I'm not raising my hand because I have not. But if you do watch C-SPAN, what you will see are the either representatives or the senators getting up and saying their bit on the floor of the House of Representatives or on the floor of the Senate. And those are the congressional debates. And you find those debates in the congressional record. So now what's going to happen is when you see a reference, you're going to see a reference to the congressional record. And what I hope you're going to remember is you're going to have in your head congressional record equals debates. And it goes the other way around. Debates equal congressional record. So if somebody asks you where to find the debates, you'll say congressional record. On the key handout, you'll see that's on the bottom of page 2 with our item number 4. You'll see a couple of the abbreviations, CONGREC. Now that you've heard the term congressional record, hopefully that makes some sense. Abbreviated if they get lazy to CR, because they can't manage all those extra little letters. So either CR or CONGREC is the congressional record. Now the congressional record is one of the most complex resources I've encountered as a law librarian. It's a lot of fun if you get into the nitty-gritty of the detail. I'm not asking you to get into the nitty-gritty or even think it's a lot of fun. But if you are leaning that way, on page 13 is a handout of where you find the debates of Congress. And just very briefly, it wasn't always called the congressional record. In earlier years, it was called other things, and that's on the handout. And if you're not interested, don't worry about it. Just remember, congressional debates equals congressional record, or debates of Congress equals congressional records, however it works in your head. So of course, as I said, it's not as good a source for legislative intent as the congressional record, because it's really just an individual congressperson getting up and saying what they think. And just because one particular legislator thinks something doesn't mean that's the intent of Congress. Congressional record is probably used more for more political science, scholarly type of research. So again, if you're writing notes or papers, congressional record might be a bit more important to you than it would be if you're doing legislative intent research. But there are a couple of things you should know about the congressional record. And we're going to go through it briefly, and you will see these references as we go through the sources of these documents later on. The congressional record comes in 2 flavors. It comes in the bound flavor, nice weightlifting. I love the sound it makes. And it comes in the daily edition flavor. This is actually a rather thick daily edition flavor, but as you can see, quite a lot less substantial and a little floppy too. I'll pass these around. So if you want to do your weightlifting. So let's take a look at what they actually look like inside on page 14 of the handout. Basically, by flavor, what I mean is the bound means all the different days congressional records got bound in a volume that Erica, hold that up, do your weightlifting for the day. So there are, what's the dates on the volume?
February 26, 1974 to March 6th.
So we've got a month's worth of congressional records in that bound volume. So on page 14, we're looking at the front page of what's going around. And let's go to page 15. You'll see what it looks like inside. And just like the oral testimony in the hearings looked like a play with telling you what each person said, the debates in Congress looks the same way. Again, debates in Congress equals what? Congressional record, excellent. So, on page 15, the debates of Congress, we see on the left-hand column, Ms. Holtzman is saying something to Mr. Chairman, and then in the middle column, Mr. Erlborn is saying something, and Ms. Holtzman is saying something. So that's essentially the bound volume. Notice on the top of the bound volume, we see what page it is, because we've got a whole month in one single volume, so it's just got regular old page numbers on it, and you will see why this is relevant in a moment. Let's now get to know the other flavor of Congressional Record, and that's the daily edition. And that makes a little more sense, or its name makes a little more sense, because the daily edition comes out, well, daily. Surprise, surprise, every work day anyway, or at least the days that Congress is in session, which isn't really daily these days, but I won't get into politics because that's a no-no. So looking at the daily edition of the Congressional Record on page 16, this happens to be from 2001, so a little further along in years than our bound edition. And we see the daily edition. It comes out a day, so it gives us the day, August 2nd, 2001. And we see that the Congressional Record, so we know it is the Congressional Record equals the debates. Yeah, no trick questions. I know it's kind of silly, but this, if you understand it, it'll be less confusing later on. Now, when the daily edition comes out, it's telling us which body of Congress it's coming from. So we see the House of Representatives. This particular daily edition is for the House of Representatives. And so it hopefully makes a little bit of sense when you look on the bottom and you see the page number is H5179. So it's page H5179 of the daily edition of the Congressional Record. So that automatically we now know, at least the daily edition, this particular page is from the House of Representatives. And again, turning to page 17, we see again, looks like the debates. We see Ms. Solis is saying something in the left-hand column, and then Mrs. McCarthy says something in the middle column, and Ms. Kilpatrick says something in the right-hand column. And again, it just looks like a play, it's telling you who's saying what. And again, notice on top of the page, this particular page is H5214. Turning to page 18, it works the same for the Senate. Except the page number looks different. Notice on the bottom right, you see S8629. So if you see an S page number, it's obviously the Senate. And none of this is, no trick questions. Now, where it gets kind of interesting, and no, this isn't going to be on your assignment or any kind of exam, so just going to go through this again if anybody's interested. The Congressional Record, as I mentioned, is a pretty complex publication. So the Congressional Record also has, in addition to H pages for the House of Representatives, S pages for the Senate pages, it has E pages. And in the soft-bound one going around, Avery has it now, I believe there are E pages in there. Not every daily edition has E pages. E-pages are known as extension of remarks, as you see on page 19. So what the Congress people get to do is, even after the day is over, and they get home at night and they realize, I should have said, they can contact, I don't even know who they contact, but they can contact the people responsible for publishing the Congressional Record, and they can say, make sure you put in that I said this, even though I wasn't there to say it. They can add remarks. So, unlike those of us who, after a conversation, wake up the next day and say, darn it, I wish I said, they can actually do it and get it in there. And this is part of the official Congressional Record. The only difference is it gets an E page instead of just an H or an S page. So that's what extension of remarks is. And the last part of the daily Congressional Record, I'll point out, and this is a little bit more useful, if you do find yourself needing to find something in the daily edition of a Congressional Record, and you have one as thick as the one that's going around, whoever has it at this point, you probably don't want to go, I don't know, that looks like that's got 100 pages at least. You don't want to have to flip through 100 pages. If you don't know where in that particular daily edition it is, you can turn to the Daily Digest and see the summary and then get the page reference that way. So on page 20, you can see there's a summary of what happened in the Senate. Because what you'll see actually, and I should mention this because it might make more sense, in the daily edition that's going around, there are actually both H pages and S pages. There are definitely D pages, and there may or may not be E pages. And as I said, in wherever it went, I think there probably are E pages in that one. But so rather than trying to flip through and figure out where the House of Representatives did whatever, if you take a look at the Daily Digest, which is usually toward the back, I think, you can figure out what page it is and turn straight to it. And so on pages 21 and 22, you get a sense of what the Daily Digest looks like. And if you were particularly interested on page 22 on what the Norwood Amendment had to say, it actually refers you to the next issue, so I just have to go to the next day and then look at the Daily Digest there and figure out what page the Norwood Amendment was discussed. Okay, that's all the detail I'm going to go into in the congressional record. There's more information you can look at more carefully in the handout later on if you want. If you have questions, I'll try to answer them later on also. Otherwise, or now, otherwise I will move on to a far more important aspect of legislative history, or a far more important document within legislative history, and that is the conference report. So back to our story here. So our bill has gone to the House of Representatives, and let's say, as it was the case with our hero, the House of Representatives all voted yes, 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 yes. So our bill passed the House of Representatives. What then has to happen is he or she then has to go, as you can see, and be dragged to the other chamber where it starts all over again. Remember in the cartoon, as soon as he got done with one chamber, he had to go to the other chamber. So that's exactly what happens with the bill. So wherever it starts, now it doesn't necessarily start in the House of Representatives. The bill can start in the Senate as well. So wherever it starts, it goes through the process, and then if it passes, it then gets referred and goes through the process in the other chamber. Now, it may be the same bill, so if it starts in the House bill may get referred to the Senate, or the Senate may start its own version of that particular measure and go through the process that way. So if it goes through one chamber and then passes, and then goes through the other chamber and then passes, as it's going through that whole process, remember these bills can be amended and changed. And in the House of Representatives, you've got 435, and you've got 100 people in the Senate. So that's a lot of people with a lot of different opinions. So you're very likely in both chambers to have different amendments coming up. And so at the end of the process, even for a single bill, the bill could wind up looking different after it passes the House and after it passes the Senate. So if that's the case, if that passes both chambers, but it looks different, each chamber then has to sit down with one another, and they have to have a conference to work out the differences so they can present one bill to the president to sign. And when they meet for that conference, that's called a conference committee. Again, not surprisingly. And if that conference committee, so basically the leaders of the House and the leaders of the Senate, appoint some people to this conference committee from each chamber, they meet. If they work out their differences and they come up with a single piece of legislation, they will produce another report, and that's called a conference report because it's part of the conference committee. If you take a look at page 23, you will see an example of a conference report that happened, because that's essentially what happened when ERISA was first proposed as a bill. It went through the House, and then it went through the Senate. It turns out what the Senate decided to do was to take a look at the House bill and then debate and amend the House bill. So that's why you see in the sort of the middle of the page to accompany H.R. 2, because that's the bill everybody decided to start with. But there were different amendments in the House than there were in the Senate. And what the conference committee report will do is it will probably explain to you where some of those differences between the House and Senate were and how they resolved it. So if that language is the language you're interested in, the conference report will be very useful for you for legislative intent research. So I would say the committee reports are the first thing I would check, but I would also check to see if there was a conference report, because it's possible everything got changed in the conference report, or some things got changed in the conference report. So let's take a closer look at that on page 23A. We see an example where the conference report, it was talking about how the House bill required annual reporting, the Senate bill requires submission of financial, and so the conference decided to adopt the reporting format contained in both. Not quite how they did that, but you'd read on to find out. And some conference reports will also have a section-by-section analysis. Again, not all, but definitely if you find a conference report, look for it. And you'll see an example on 23B that this particular conference report did have. So this particular conference report talks about preemption of state laws and actually goes into far more detail than the committee report we were looking at. So this conference report would have been a good find if we determined that we really needed to find out what the legislative intent was of our section 1144, our preemption section. Any questions about what the conference report is, why you want to look at it, about any of the other documents in the process so far? So last but not least, remember, we have the president signing the bill, signing our hero, and turning it into a law. And in addition to signing the bill's forehead, all right, not the forehead, just sign on the dotted line on the bottom, the president may also produce what's called a signing statement. Usually not very substantive in terms of legislative intent research, probably more interesting, again, for more scholarly research if you're writing a paper or a note. With one exception, have any of you in constitutional law or any other class talked about the unitary executive theory? About 10 years ago, this was actually quite a controversy because President Bush at the time was using this theory basically to insert language in his signing statements to try to affect legislative intent. Because there are lots of lawyers who, even though Justice Scalia didn't think it was persuasive, a lot of other judges did. And so the president would put in this language. Anyway, it doesn't happen too much at this point in time, but there may be other presidents who think this is a good idea and adopt it again. Don't worry about it. Again, just a point of interest if it is of interest. But take a look at a signing statement from President Ford, who signed into law our ERISA law. And you will see what it looks like turning on page 25 and then turning to page 26. Where again, just to bring around the story into full circle, we see that our President Ford signs the bill into law, issues his signing statement, as we see in these presidential documents, and we see with our handy-dandy arrow that it is indeed Public Law 93-406, which we've been talking about a lot. So one thing I've neglected to mention, we talked a lot about how congressional record equals debates, and debates equal congressional record, and what those abbreviations are. I neglected to talk about the abbreviation of conference reports. The abbreviation of conference reports is going to confuse you because the abbreviation for conference report doesn't sound like a conference report. It looks like either a House report or a Senate report. And you sometimes won't know it's a conference report till you read the first paragraph. So a lot of times I've seen conference reports referred to as House reports or as House conference reports. So sometimes they help you. It's very inconsistent. I have to concede, I don't know why. You will sometimes see Senate conference reports. But again, in the abbreviation, you may or may not see it designated as a conference report. And in terms of abbreviation for presidential documents, as you can see on the key handout, you'll either see the weekly compilation of presidential documents or the daily compilation. Again, it's not something you'll be encountering too often. And of course, once the president signs our bill into law, we already know that abbreviation is our hero, the public law PL. Any questions? Okay, I think now would probably be a good time for a break. We will come back and we will talk about how to find the all-important public law number. We'll take a look at a few key resources, and then, yes, we will have a workshop to do where you will try to apply all of this. And just so you know, the workshop, there's got a lot of stuff in it. If we don't finish today, I'm leaving time for next week so we can finish it off, so you don't have to worry about getting through it all. So let's come back at 5:25 to talk about all-important public law numbers. Okay, so let's go to page 4 of the key handout. So we now hopefully have a sense of what the legislative process is. We understand the different documents that are produced and why, excuse me, why we might or might not want to look at them. In order to find these documents when we're doing legislative intent research, in other words, when we want to figure out what either Congress thought about particular language in a statute or the state legislature thought about particular language in the statute, we're starting with the statute section probably, right? So we're looking at 1144 or section 4408 or 4410 or whatever sections we're looking at for your assignments. And we're wondering, what did Congress say about this particular language? So the way to find the all-important public law number, because that's how you're going to find all the documents that we've just been discussing, or whatever documents were produced that we've just been discussing, is starting with the all-important public law or chapter, if we're in New York, number. Now we already know how to do part of it, so there are really two parts to finding the all-important public law number. We already know the first part, and that's by looking at the history of the particular section we're looking at. Remember, we've done this a whole lot looking at, on the key handout, I call it the parenthetical, because that's really all it looks like in the print. But here on Westlaw, we know it as the credits. So we would scroll down to the credits. And we already know how to read this. So we know that 1144 was first enacted by what public law? 93-406, right here. And then it was amended by all these subsequent public laws. So hopefully you're wondering, okay, so how do I know which of those public laws I have to know before to look for all these documents? Do I have to look at all of them? Well, the answer is hopefully not. You probably will need to look at 93-406 because it's likely what enacted your language, but not necessarily, because remember, statutes can be amended and sections can be added later on, right? You've seen that. So that's where part 2 comes. So we already know part 1 is looking at the credits. So part 2 comes with the part that we haven't talked about yet, and that is looking at what are called the historical and statutory notes. So here on Westlaw, and we'll look on Lexis, Bloomberg, and in print in just a moment to see what it looks like there. Here on Westlaw, we go to history. Hopefully that makes some amount of sense because we're talking about legislative history. And then here's the part that may or may not make a whole lot of sense, and that is editors and revisers' notes. I don't know why the Westlaw calls it that. And what we see are historical and statutory notes. That's what it's called in print, which is why I refer to it that way. And again, Westlaw's name makes no sense to me, so I tend not to remember it, to be perfectly honest with you. But so here in the editors and revisers notes, so here we see sort of a summary of different House reports, but actually what you want to look at first, and Again, I don't know why Westlaw does it this way, but they do. You want to actually scroll down to the amendments, because what the amendments section tells you in that editors and revisers notes is what the different amendments from each of the public laws did. So in other words, in 2006, our section was amended by Public Law 109-280, and it was subsection E in our section in section 1144. Turns out subsection E in 1144 was added by 109-280. So if the language I was interested, or you were interested in, was subsection E, you wouldn't want to look at 93-406 because it didn't exist back then when it was in 1974 when ERISA was passed. You'd actually want to look at 109-280. So you would scan through, if you knew which subsection, you would scan through. If there wasn't a particular subsection, if you're just interested generally in what the law had to say, which arguably is the case for our client, right? She's just interested in whether or not preempted. She doesn't care about the particular language. Then you'd probably go to when it was initially enacted back in 1974 to our friend 93-406. So again, just to review reading these, so 98, I learned that subsection B7 of our section 1144 was somehow amended, and the public law that amended it was 105-200, and it's section 401H2A1. So that's a mouthful. Within that public law, and it's telling me how it was amended. Amended directory language, requiring no change in text. Requiring no change in text, I'm probably not interested in. But actually, Public Law 105-200 also did something else. It struck out enforced by and inserted they apply to. Again, I'm not sure if that's substantive, if we really care. So you would scan through these various changes as it goes back in time to the various different amendments, hopefully figuring out which public law, and it might be multiple public laws, but most likely you want just the latest public law. If you have a particular subsection, you want the latest public law. You probably also, again, want to look at the original unless your particular language was enacted later. Does that make sense? Because this is a new concept we haven't talked about before. So again, those editors, revisers, notes, and just scan through. If we take a look at the handout, page 27, just to review doing it, what it looks like in print, maybe it'll make a little more sense. Again, this is the U.S. Code annotated, so this is the equivalent of what we just saw in Westlaw. So looking at our section 1144 on page 28, turning to page 29, we go to what I call the parenthetical because it's got no other name in print, because it's in parentheses is the best I could come up with. And again, we see the exact thing we saw in the credits, starting with Public Law 93-406. And then right below that in print, we see the historical and statutory notes. Again, there's no editors and advisors reference there. That's something Westlaw made up. And I can't really tell you why they made it up. And turning the page from page 29, again, the historical and statutory notes tells you which section each amendment affected to help you determine which public law number to use. So again, this is why I've got you this fat handout to help remind you of all of this later on. So turning to page 30, we jump in the historical and statutory notes, we jump past the initial portion to the amendments, and this is where we see what we just looked at, basically what the 2006 amendments did, what the 98 amendments did. It gives us the references to the public laws for each of those amendments, so we could figure out which public laws we needed to investigate. So you can see in the right-hand column, sort of midway down, there's a big fat paragraph that gives us a lot of detail. So it has to do with section B8. If that was important to us, we might want to investigate Public Law 103-66. So again, just giving you an example of how your reasoning might work as you look through each of these amendments. Okay. And on pages 31 and 32 is really just the pocket part. There are no additional, again, remember in the print, you always need to check the pocket part, but there are no additional changes, so there are no public laws referenced, so the pocket part actually in this instance is irrelevant. And I kind of went a little bit out of order from our handout, but that's okay. Pages 33 and 34 pretty much go over what we just did on Westlaw. Again, I put these pages in the hopes of reminding you how this worked if you need it, if you would like to look back at a later date. So we see the different public law numbers, and then we see the editors and revisers notes. I show you the drop down on page 34 and scrolling down to the amendments. Okay, so let's take a quick look at Lexis Advance. Again, the handout is reflecting what I'm doing here on the screen. Handout by way of reminding you later on. So here's section 1144. So we could either scroll or use our go-to menu to jump down to the history. Again, our parenthetical, credits on Westlaw, whatever you wanted to call it. And you would see the various different public laws. And then we would just scroll down to the amendments. And interestingly, for whatever reason, Lexis lists them in chronological order rather than reverse chronological order. So we start with the 83, and we would get what the different amendments did and the public law numbers that enacted those particular amendments. Everybody make sense on Lexis? Bloomberg isn't really good about giving you that information, so Bloomberg, once again, needs some catching up. Actually, that's our other section. So it does, Bloomberg I find is inconsistent in terms of whether it gives you the parenthetical information. Bloomberg wants, come on, oh tell me it's going to get fussy on me again. It's been doing okay. Have you been doing all right on Bloomberg? I know you don't love the some of you anyway don't love the content, but have you been able to get where you need to go? I'm actually trying to work through problems in the university. Okay, I'm not going to fight with this. Hopefully you'll take my word that Bloomberg's inconsistent in terms of giving you this information. Okay, so that is finding the all-important public law number. If, for whatever reason, you weren't starting with a section number, although I think most of the time you will, but you were starting with a popular name. So Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, ERISA. Remember the good old popular name table, which again, if you just Google popular name, you can find the public. So let's see if we can. Here we go. And I'm not going to scroll down to ERISA. Hopefully you all get the idea. You can see the public law numbers as well as where in the USC you would find it. Again, remember, if that was your question, you just want to see what the law is today, we talked about that. This popular name tool is good for that as well. And then, of course, you would go to the table 3 translation table. But okay, so again, most of the time you'll be starting with a section, go to the parenthetical, credits, history, whatever it's called, and then look at the historical and statutory notes, the editors and revisions on Westlaw, the history on Lexis, and look at the amendments so you can figure out which public law you need to check. Most likely it's going to be the first one, but possibly your section was, or your language was added later. So that's finding the all-important public law number. Why do I keep on calling it the all-important public law number? You're hopefully tired of hearing that by now, and that is because for our step 4, the most useful resources for legislative history, back here on the key handout. That's what you need to use them, is the all-important public law number. And now we are talking about federal for the moment. We'll talk about state and using the chapter law next week. So, actually doing legislative intent research. We've done all this leading up to actually doing the research because you needed to understand the process. You needed to understand what the documents were and what they looked like and how they were abbreviated. We needed to make sure we knew how to find that all-important public number. So, what are we going to do? What's our strategy? Well, it depends on, classic lawyer answer, it depends. Depends how much you need. Are you doing legislative intent because you just need a general idea, maybe see if you can find what Congress is saying? Or do you really need to go into the weeds and see if you can find some reference to your particular language? And it does depend because there's an easy way to do it, and then there's a far more involved, time-consuming way to do it. And obviously, you don't want to do the time-consuming if you don't have to. So basically, if you just need to hopefully get some sort of sense, then you might just want to check the committee report. Or it may be multiple reports because a piece of legislation like ERISA was considered by many different committees because it covered many different topics. It covered employment, and it covered health, and it covered pensions, and it covered tax. So it went to all these different committees, and they produced reports. So obviously for our client, we're not really worried about the tax stuff, so we're not going to check the tax reports. But certainly any committee having to do with employees will certainly be checking, and possibly health, probably not pension, because that's not the part of ERISA we're looking for. So you might go to the committee reports, and again, making sure you check the conference report, because the conference report could have changed everything, or it might just have something interesting that it didn't change. Or if you need something far more involved, you need to gather all of the documents and take a look. So let's start with what I think is the best place to look for legislative intent when you've got the massive project. And that's going to be Hein Online. Remember Hein Online from Law Journals? Looked at Hein Online before. The Hein Online is the best place, mostly because it is searchable, text searchable. You don't have to read through all of these documents. And believe me, they can be thousands of pages, and I'm not exaggerating. For ERISA, I think it is thousands of pages. So really, you really want to be able to do full text searching. And thankfully, for major pieces of legislation like ERISA, Hein Online will tend to have it. Not always, I can't promise you every single one. The other thing, obviously, I can't promise is when you graduate, whether you'll have access to Hein Online wherever you're working. Of course, you can always come back here, as we've mentioned many times, and you would be able to get on Hein Online on our public terminals. But if you're further afield and can't make it back here, you may or may not have access. But if you do, so I may have to log back into Hein Online, we'll see. But let's see. So what you want to do, and again in the handout, I've walked you through the process with screenshots. I'm going to do it now live here. So here on Hein Online, you'll remember how to get to Hein Online? The library, you can just, library website, we've actually got a link on the front page under online resources. Where you want to go, rather than the law journals, which is up here, we want to go to U.S. Federal Legislative History. And it sounds silly for me to be emphasizing it, but if you start looking under L in the Hein Online list, or F for federal, you're not going to find it. You have to remember U.S. Obviously, if you just do Control F, you'll find it that way too, but you have to think to do that as well. So, under U.S. Federal Legislative History Library, it gives you this little drop-down thing. Good, we're still signed in. And I just want to choose the title collection. And I do have to sign it, but that's okay. I hope. Yay! Okay, so Hein Online. Hein Online, I can search for publication title, but I don't exactly know what it's going to be called. If I have the popular name, I do, ERISA, I could try to find it that way, but maybe it's ERISA, maybe it's employee retirement. And this is why I call it the all-important public law number. If I have it, I mean, yes, you can use popular name, but if I have the all-important public law number, I think this is actually the surefire way to do it, which to me means it's easier. If I just know I'm going to have to go through this once and I'll find it. So I go to, we know we want 93406. Remember, that's our enacting public law number, so that's the one we'll use for example. So I click on the 93rd Congress and I can scroll down, or actually I'm going to be a bit lazy and do Control F and just go to 406, which will jump me down to the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. And Hein Online is actually giving me choices of 2 different collections without spending a lot of time analyzing the difference. Basically, you're just going to choose one. Honestly, 3 volumes is a whole lot less than 22 volumes, so I'm going to guess that this is more complete. That may or may not be true. It doesn't choose one, basically, is the bottom line. The important part is, however, whichever one you choose, you will be presented with a screen with either a choice of a lot of volumes and cumulative contents or just the 3 volumes. The important part to remember is the search this title box. And it's this search this title box, not the search box on top. Trust me, I've made that mistake a lot. This is going to search all of Hein Online. That's not going to help you very much. You want to search just the title of Employee Benefit Security Act. And here's where you can search, and you need to be really creative about your search terms. When I've done actually done legislative intent research, I've searched keywords. I've also sometimes searched by section number. I've searched both section USC section, because sometimes a public law is changing already existing section, or I've searched the public law section because I wanted to see if Congress has talked about section 514. Remember, that's our section. So I've done any of the above. So again, you just have to be creative. I'm going to search just a term preemption so you can see what it looks like. And so again, the nice thing is I can do a full text search. I see the various different types of places where the word preemption appears. And what Hein Online also does is it breaks down the different types of documents. Now, as I mentioned, for legislative intent, I'm going to want to look at reports. So I'm always also going to want to look at show more to see what my options are. So unfortunately, I'm going to look at House reports and I'm going to look at Senate reports. I probably don't want to look at the hearings. Again, the hearings, remember, are people's testimony before the Congress as well as written testimony before the committees in Congress to tell you what they think. That's not really going to tell me what Congress was thinking. I'm going to want to go to the reports. With Hein Online, I have to go to one at a time. So that will bring me to House reports, and I can see where in the House reports the term preemption was mentioned, and I can look to see if that's going to give me any insight as to what Congress was, what their intent was in passing Section 514 in ERISA. Any questions about Hein Online? So that's if you really need to look through all of the documents. I mean, especially if you're doing scholarly research, then you don't want to just limit to reports, and Hein Online is even more useful because then you want to see, maybe you want to see what the Congress people said in debates, and debates would be found where? Congressional record. Excellent. But again, for intent research, the reports and the conference report are what you're going to want to look at. So in the handout, you'll see basically what I just did on pages 37 through 38. The best place, I mean, if you have Hein Online available and you just have to do quick research, that's fine too. But especially if you don't have Hein Online available, and you don't really have to necessarily do complete research, or maybe you do, but you want to get a start. We've been here already, congress.gov. Congress.gov, what we've already seen are the list of public laws. So here's the current Congress, so it takes us up to what laws have recently been enacted here on this screen. But Congress.gov gives us more information than just this list, and it also lets us go back in time. Now, it doesn't go back in time as far as Hein Online does, but the advantage of Congress.gov is it has every single public law, at least for the time period it covers, which, taking a look here, goes back to 1970 something, I believe. Actually, we would have just made it in with ERISA, 1973. Bad thing about Congress.gov is it's not going to give us full text of everything. It's not going to reference everything, and the further back you go in time, the fewer links you have, which I imagine you run into with other websites as well. So how Congress.gov works is, again, if you have your all-important public law number, which as you can see is where we're starting here, I'm actually going to use a different public law number. I'm going to use the last public law that amended our section 1144, which you might remember is 109-280. I don't expect you to remember that. So I know 109-280 is the 109th Congress. And again, I'm going to sheet and do Control F for 280. And we haven't gotten this far in Congress.gov before. What Congress.gov provides for us is a summary of what happened with this public law. So major recorded votes, the latest action, and we already knew this, but it became public law, and committees. It's not giving us much more information than this. Again, the disadvantage of a free website is you get what you pay for, so you don't get quite as much. So if I'm going to go back to our list here, and I'm going back to our list here to show you, I just want to make sure I pick a good one. 266 is a good one. And this is, I just looked at this earlier. I just want you to see what it looks like when Congress.gov does have some useful documents. And besides, the electronic Duck Stamp Act, how could I not look at that? I know. You're like, has to be some fun to be had with all of this, right? So the electronic Duck Stamp Act. Turns out Congress.gov does give us some information about the Duck Stamp Act. So we get a link to a House report and a Senate report. House report, Senate report. Gives us the same information. And if we wanted more detail, we could see the different actions. So we see what happened from when it was first introduced to the Senate and as it made its way through Congress. So Congress.gov, as you can see, is somewhat bare bones, certainly not complete. But if you just needed quick and dirty research, as they say, that would be a good place to go. Obviously, it's also free, so you don't have to worry about access. Wherever you have access to the web, you have access to Congress.gov. The other thing Congress.gov does for us, and honestly, I happen to think it's one of the better places, forget about free. I mentioned when we first started class that two reasons you're doing legislative history, legislative intent, which we've spent most of our time on, but also bill tracking. If you want to find out what happened to a particular bill, whether it's one that's still pending or maybe it was a bill that got introduced 5 years ago, I happen to think Congress.gov is a good place. You can search by the bill. So you'd have this search by number, and that would give you going back in time a little bit. I'm just going to, I'm sure I can figure that out. I'm just going to show you what a bill tracking looks like, since we've talked about it, but I haven't shown you yet. So taking a look at just the bill that Congress.gov highlighted, if we take a look at actions, again, that actions tab, basically not much is, let's do all actions, which isn't very many, it's only 4, so this bill has just gotten started. basically you can see what a bill tracking would look like. It's basically just that actions tab. So you can see it was introduced in the House, it was referred, just like our friend the bill, our hero, referred to the House Committee on Transportation. The committee considered it and had a markup session, and then it was ordered to be reported, amended by yeas and nays, 34 to 25. So the committee basically said, yes, we think this is a good idea, so there probably will be a report issued. I don't know about probably, maybe be a report issue, but that's as far as we got as of February 11th. So a week or two ago. So that's bill tracking. That's what bill tracking will tell you. And again, something where there's been more action, see a lot more entries there, and you can do bill tracking not just for current Congress, but you can go back in time with the search by number. Any questions about congress.gov or anything else we've done thus far? Okay. Moving on, so we're still talking about useful resources. So Hein Online, number 1. Congress.gov, arguably number 2. I would say tied for 2, maybe 3, again, depending on what you need to do, is another database, and this is a subscription database that costs boatloads of money, so you're not going to find access to it in too many places. I'm not sure even if the huge giant law firms in New York, too many of them have access, because we are talking boatloads of money. It's called ProQuest Congressional. Don't know if any of you have used it before. Honestly, the easiest way to get there, again, the library homepage is, here's our quick link to Hein Online. We don't have a quick link to ProQuest, so on this Find Research Guide and Online Resources, I would type in ProQuest. You could also go to the alphabetical or topic list and browse your way that way. But I'm into doing it the easy way, so if you type in, just have to remember ProQuest, admittedly, and then we click here. And some of you, if you're following along on your laptops, may get prompted to log in. Again, it's the same remote login that we've been using, first name, last name, your 700-0102 numbers. And you will get to ProQuest Congressional. ProQuest Congressional, honestly, these days is more designed for politics-type research, politicians, political science, scholars, but the legislative history and the bills by number aspects are useful for us. ProQuest used to me, be the end-all and be-all of legislative history research. So here's an example where websites, databases evolve over time. So you always have to be a little bit on your toes and see what it does, what it stopped doing. So unfortunately, ProQuest isn't quite as user-friendly as it used to be, but it's still pretty good. So we want legislative history, so we're interested in legislative intent. Click on legislative history. And here's where ProQuest, in my opinion, is not as user-friendly as it used to be, but it's still okay. So you'll notice here the document types, it's clicked off a document type called legislative history, which is good, and you'll see why in a moment, hopefully agree. So the easiest way I've found to get to what we want, what is useful for us for legislative intent, is again to know our all-important public law number, so figure out what that is, whether original enacting or amending. I'm going to go with original enacting, 93406, and just search for it. Yes, you can browse through, but honestly, it's a lot more difficult. So you'll get typically one or several results when you do this search, and you just have to figure out which one it is. Which is one reason why I think it's not as user-friendly as it used to be, because it used to just bring you right there. But anyway, you can kind of figure out we want Employee Retirement Income Security Act and not the Grand Canyon National Park. Although that does look kind of fun, but we'll save that for another day. So in ERISA, what ProQuest provides for us, ProQuest is far more comprehensive than Congress.gov. It's about equally comprehensive as Hein Online if Hein Online has our law. But Hein Online doesn't have every single law. That's one advantage to ProQuest. ProQuest will have every single law going back to 1970. And again, I don't expect you to remember any of these dates. What you should try to remember is that there's not one resource that has absolutely everything. ProQuest is comprehensive back to 1970, but Hein Online is better for pre-1970. For some things, but Hein Online doesn't have everything. They pick and choose what legislative histories they think are important. So they think ERISA is important, so we got lucky. But if you're looking for another law that they don't think is important, you don't get lucky. But if it's after 1970, then you remember ProQuest. Again, that's the challenge of legislative history research is there's not one place. And you also have to understand what you're looking at. So ProQuest, because ERISA is after 1970, has our comprehensive list, and you can see here on the left the various types of documents we've been talking about. I've got some other information as well. So you can jump straight to reports if that's what you want to see. The disadvantage to ProQuest is it's not full text searchable. You have to look at each document that you want to investigate, which obviously is a lot more time consuming than what we just did on Hein Online, which is why I say go to Hein Online first. The other thing about ProQuest, which they also have made more difficult over time, is actually getting to the documents that you have to look at. So if you are interested in the Committee on Labor, to get to that particular report, you need to know to click on the link. And I know that number makes sense, doesn't make sense rather. Don't worry about it. Just know you see a link under reports, so that's the link. And now it's bringing you to basically some information about that particular report. And it gives you a nice summary, which is sort of good. And you have to know these days to scroll down in order to find the links to the PDFs. And actually in the handout, again, another reason why it's so fat, I show you the screens for congress.gov as a reminder, and Hein Online, and I'm going backwards, helps if I go forward. So congress.gov, and then I show you on ProQuest. So you have that as a reminder. And then you can take a look at the entire report. I'm not going to load it because it's a big PDF and it will take a while. Or you can just see selected pages. They do tend to be full text searchable, so that's a help. But again, you'd have to look at each document if you're going to use ProQuest. The other thing that's frustrating about ProQuest is if you want to find, remember I mentioned conference reports can be confusing because sometimes they just are referred to as an HRPT or REP or Senate RPT or REP. So if you want to figure out if there is a conference report on ProQuest, the only way to do that is once you get to the legislative history for Public Law 93-406, the only way is to do Control F and to look for the word conference. And once I start searching, as you can see, there is a reference in the debates. And again, remember, debates equal congressional record. I see there's reference to a conference report that was mentioned in the congressional record. So then what I need to do, and I know this is involved, and I have had choice words for ProQuest on this, is basically what I do is, okay, I've now confirmed there is a conference report. So I now go to the report section. I scroll to the end of the report section, and the reason I scroll to the end of the report section is that I have reason conference report happens at the end of the process, and I look at the last report. Because you don't really see conference. Why they can't put the word conference in there is beyond me. So hence the choice words. But anyway, so I look at the report. And in the summary, it finally tells me conference report. Yes, totally annoying, totally frustrating, and a lot of extra work than it should be. I will agree with you on all of that, but on ProQuest, that's how you do it, which is another reason why I would go to Hein Online first, if what I need is available there. And even congress.gov, if there is a conference report, they may or may not reproduce it for you. They're just going to give you on congress.gov whatever reports they feel like giving you. Sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. Again, I don't know if there's any rhyme or reason to that. ProQuest. Any questions about that? Because I know that is definitely involved. ProQuest is also good for bill tracking. Let's get back to the home page here. Should you need to do that, and that would be bills by number. Again, it kind of looks like congress.gov. They'll link you. I guess the advantage to ProQuest is because ProQuest has so many more full-text documents than does congress.gov. They'll link you to more of those documents that you get referenced in the bill tracking. But otherwise, it works pretty much the same way. You'd have your bill number, so you'd need to know what Congress it was from. You'd need to know the bill number, whether it's House or Senate, and then you put in the number there. And as you can see, bills go back pretty far. So that's another advantage to ProQuest. Bills go back to 1789. You actually won't get the full text, but you should get tracking. Questions about ProQuest. So each of these resources have their advantages and disadvantages. Maybe someday they'll tie them all together, or not tie them all together, just give us one-stop shopping. Okay. Some of you had asked, and I still feel like I'd be a little bit remiss if I didn't mention, only because you see reference to it in a lot of places. Lots of law review articles that reference legislative history actually reference UScan. Perhaps that's because it's print, and all of you law journal sorts still prefer the print and PDFs. I don't know. So UScan does a couple. One of the screencast question was, what is the difference between UScan and statutes at large? And the answer is statutes at large and UScan both give you public laws. What UScan does that statutes at large do not is UScan gives you some legislative history. So we'll take a look briefly at this. I will not be asking you to look at UScan for legislative history, but at least you will have seen it once, and I will feel like I have done my job. So on page 46, and we have some show and tell here in a moment. So we have UScan for our public law. Again, we need that all-important public law number, 93406. So we know that 93406, we would have to know that 93406 is in 1974. And we go to the shelf in UScan and look for our year. And we've already seen this when we talked about statutes and public law. So on page 46, we saw UScan Volume 1. And on page 47, we saw that UScan, the ERISA within UScan Public Law 93406 looks just like it did in the statutes at large. What we didn't see in the statutes at large was what's underlined at the top of the page for legislative history of Act. See page 4639. And the other thing I want to point out, which I should have mentioned earlier, honestly, is the public law could actually be a really good source for legislative intent. So looking at page 48, before we dive in further to UScan, we're looking at Public Law 93406. This is what it would look like in UScan. This is what it is in UScan. It's what it would look like in the statutes at large. If you went to 93406 on any of the sources that we've looked at so far, this is what you would see. You'd see Title I, Protection of Employee Benefit Rights, Subtitle A, General Provisions. You'd see Findings and Declaration of Policy. That sounds a little bit like intent, right? So in the law itself, Congress, or sometimes the state legislature, will sometimes, not always, actually tell you what they want to accomplish. So if you're making a general argument, well, Congress wanted to do this with preemption, so therefore we shouldn't be preempted, you might be going just to the act itself and reading the findings of the Declaration of Policy in Declaration 2. So Congress finds that the growth in size, scope, and numbers of employee benefit plans in recent years has been rapid, blah, 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 and so forth. It is Section B, it is hereby declared to be the policy of this act to protect interstate commerce and the interests of participants' employee benefit plans. So maybe I want to make an argument. Hey, Congress really meant for my client to be protected. Look. I don't know how far you get with that, honestly, but so another source of intent might be the law itself. And in fact, that would be the first place I'd look even before the committee report. They don't always have a section in there, but that is important to remember. Questions? So moving back to other legislative history in USCAN. So remember, USCAN, the public law in USCAN referred us to page 4639. So it's just referring us to a different volume. So here's the volume one we were just looking at, and it says laws here on the spine. So that's telling me that's where I find laws, also known as public laws. And there's a little tab here if you really, we did this once before, but really just check out the spine so it looks a little bit familiar again. I don't know if you'll ever use it again. So it refers us to page 9639, that's again within 1974. So now I'm just pulling up volume 3. Actually, I got the page number wrong, but it doesn't matter. What does matter is on the spine, it's now not saying laws anymore, it's saying legislative history. So that's telling me, okay, here's the part of USCAN that has legislative history stuff. We already showed you the laws in volumes 1 and 2. Now let's turn the page. So 49 is volume 3. We saw that was legislative history on the spine. Let's turn the page and see what actually is in USCAN for legislative history. On page 50, basically you see USCAN giving you a summary of the documents. Back in the day before ProQuest and Congress.gov and Hein Online, this was actually one of the better sources for legislative history research. But we've got these others now that are indeed more powerful, so not too many people use USCAN for legislative history research anymore, but here it is. You see a few House reports, a couple of Senate reports. You do see the conference report. Actually, there were 2 conference reports. That's kind of unusual, actually, but that's one advantage to USCAN over ProQuest anyway. Gives you the dates of consideration and passage. That would be the only way you'd figure out where to go in the congressional record. For what? What are we looking in congressional record for?
Congressional debates.
Congressional debates. And then what USCAN does, which is one reason why it gets cited to in law review articles, is it actually sets forth a House report, well, a committee report or 2. Maybe a House report, maybe a Senate report, may even be a conference report. It doesn't set forth all of them. Sometimes it might set forth more than one. But you can see the beginning of one of the reports on page 50. And so a lot of articles refer to USCAN as the print source for a report. And that's essentially the difference between USCAN and statutes at large. Again, I'm not sure how often you will be using USCAN, certainly in print. You will, however, occasionally see, and the other reason to understand what it is, you will see reference to USCAN on Westlaw, because USCAN is a West publication, so Westlaw has put USCAN. So you might run across that one way or the other. Any questions? Okay. So last but not least, well, actually last but least, legislative history on Westlaw, Lexis, and Bloomberg, in that order of preference. Westlaw isn't bad. I don't think it's as good as any of the other online resources we've looked at. And also, since you will more likely have something like Lexis or Westlaw available to you than you will ProQuest, good to know how it works. So actually, we are going to go back to our document so I can show you that. And not surprisingly, you'll go to the History tab. And once you figure out your all-important public law number, see it's even important on Westlaw, you'll want to take it to the legislative history materials. So that at least is straightforward, I think. And what that does is that brings you a list of those all-important public law numbers in reverse chronological order. So it starts with the most recent public law, 109-280 first, and it gives you links to whatever Westlaw has available in terms of legislative history. So for 109, 280, it has a lot of joint committee prints. Joint committee is a tax committee, by the way. For those of you into tax, it gives you a bunch of links to the congressional record. So, and I won't ask you again, yes, that means it's giving you links to debates. And it gives you the different dates. Notice the numbers are with letters, so those are links to the daily edition. Okay, very important on Westlaw because everybody gets confused about this. Westlaw calls it testimony. I hate that. It's testimony before committees. These are the hearings. Remember, they have interested parties come, experts in the field, people from interest groups across the spectrum come before the committee or subcommittee and say why they think the bill is a great idea or a terrible idea. They give testimony, and I guess that's why Westlaw calls it, but people get testimony confused with debates. Testimony does not equal debates. I've written this for some of you on your assignments. Does not equal. So testimony is not debates. Testimony is hearings. Presidential messages, hopefully, is pretty straightforward. So you scroll down on Westlaw, and you have to read carefully because we now move to a less recent public law 105-200. And then we do see reports. We didn't see any reports for 109-280, but we do see some for 105-200. It's not that there aren't any reports for 109-280, it's just Westlaw doesn't give us any links to them. So this is why I say Westlaw is not as good as the others, but it's not terrible, in my opinion anyway. And again, so I'm scrolling through, seeing congressional records, so I've seen the debates. More testimony, again, testimony is hearings, and another presidential message, and then we get to a new public law number, slightly older, and again, same thing. Make sense? Questions? Okay, moving in order of preference to Lexis. And honestly, I think Lexis goes down a huge step from Westlaw on this. Sorry to those of you who are Lexis prefers, if that's a word. There's no good way to get to legislative history, what the little bit Lexis has from the section itself. What you need to do, and honestly this is not nearly a good way of doing it, and I don't suggest it, and as a result I'm not going to ask you to do it, is you need to do a search. So notice I did our favorite search, HMO liability. I narrowed to statutes and legislation. And within statutes and legislation, remember on Lexis, normally to look at a code section, we would have to narrow to code. Well, instead of code, we've narrowed to legislative history. Now, all this does is this tells me any legislative history document that mentions HMO and liability. It might not even be a document that ultimately was involved in a public law that was involved in a public law. In other words, a measure that became law. There are lots of laws that have congressional record debates and have hearings and have even possibly reports that never become law. The Congress votes it down. The president vetoes it. Any number of reasons. So this might be good if you're doing scholarly research and want to find out what congressional documents are out there on a particular topic. But so Lexis doesn't do us very well for legislative history. And yes, they do actually have something similar to ProQuest, but getting there is tremendously difficult. If you find yourself working somewhere where you have to do legislative history research and all you have available is Lexis, call Lexis. Maybe by that time it will have changed. Lexis advances, trying to catch up to Westlaw, so maybe by the time you have to do it, they will have. But at the moment, they haven't, in my humble opinion. And last, and definitely least, Bloomberg. Same caveat applies in terms of looking at your section. Bloomberg doesn't give you anything. The best suggestion I can give if you are looking at Bloomberg and the only thing you have, well, I go to congress.gov, honestly, because that's free and you can get there no matter what. There is this legislative and regulatory tab, which brings you, and you can go to legislative resources. Yeah. Oh, Bloomberg's being sketchy, so I'm not even going to fight with it. But this is what it looks like anyway. Oh, good. So you really won't be doing legislative history research on Bloomberg. It's slightly different for states, especially for Lexis. We'll look at that next time. But for federal, of the three, Westlaw is by far, I think, the best. But honestly, we've seen Hein Online again, then Congress.gov, and ProQuest again, depending on what you needed, because they are very different with the very different coverage. Questions? Okay, so we have to recap, and then I'm going to pass out workshop. We've looked at the legislative process, so we've seen I'm Just a Bill. And by the way, again, all these links, including I'm Just a Bill, is on the course website under Class Web Links, so you can see I'm Just a Bill. We've looked more carefully at the documents produced in that whole process. We understand committee reports and conference reports are probably the best place to look for intent. We know that congressional record equals debate. We know that on Westlaw, testimony equals hearings. We know how to find the all-important public law number, again, the parenthetical at the end, whether you call it credits or history. And then we look at historical and statutory notes or the editor's and reviser's notes if you're on Westlaw to see which public law number we need. Then we take that all-important public law number and we look at either Hein Online, Congress.gov, maybe ProQuest, maybe Westlaw. Okay. So with I'm going to pass this around, and as it goes around, I'll explain it. Not to trip on anything. I'm going to start with the U.S. Code section. And by the way, I'll ask you each to do individual work, but feel free to consult amongst yourselves if you like to do that. So I'm going to ask you to start with the U.S. Code section, and then so you'll see the questions on one side of the page, on the other side of the page you'll see a table. So I'm going to ask you to fill in the table. So I'm going to ask you, again, basically just to repeat the U.S. Code section you're starting with, find the all-important public law number, and if you see it, tell me what the popular name is. If you don't see it, don't worry about it. And then what I will ask you to do is fill in the information on the top row is question 2A. First you'll want to answer question 1, which we've gone over. Then I want you to list the documents in the chart. You will not find every single type of document. Remember that some documents you won't see frequently at all. Depends on the public law. You may or may not see some of these other documents. List the most recent one that seems the most relevant to your code section. Just read the name of the document and see if it sounds relevant. I'm not really worried about it. I'm just trying to give you, I only want you to list one document, so I'm giving you a way to decide which one to list. But a very, very, very quick analysis of relevance. Then in either Congress, or actually no, let's be specific, on ProQuest you should find a committee report. At least you'll actually find a bunch of committee reports. Look at that report. So in other words, get to the report, click on the link, scroll down, and pull up the PDF and see if you can find the section-by-section analysis. Best way to do that is Control F, I think. And see if you can find the section-by-section analysis and then just find the purpose of just one of the sections for part B of question 3 and summarize it in a very short sentence and tell me which section you're looking at. And then if there's time, which I suspect there will not be, look on Hein Online for the word students in a report. And tell me what page number of Hein Online you find that on. And as I said, I fully expect not to finish this evening, so we will finish it up next time. But I will ask you to give me back what you've done so far so I can go through and see where the areas of confusion might be. Any questions? Let's dive in.